So this is my palette color card that goes along with my palette. Let's see, my solid colors represented there. For this exercise, I am going to be using my palette and then also a mixing well that I will be cleaning in between. And I'm using my card to show you the colors that I am going to be mixing. So I've created a grid and I put 5 different blues that I have in my palette at the top and 5 different warm colors from yellows, an ochre to a brown, a burnt orange. So we can take a look at to see what combinations those colors produce. And I'm going to be working on making it a 50-50 ratio, but using a bit more water so that you can see what it would look like if you were painting it as a mid layer. If you use the darkest version of the color, you get the darkest version of the possible mixed color, which is also useful information, but having the lighter tones or the mid layers can be really helpful as well. So before I start, I just want to paint a little tiny bit of each one of these colors to represent the pure color form. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that at the very top. So we have phthalo blue and peacock blue. And again, I'm going to do it like a mid-tone. Not the darkest it can go, but an example. There's a Prussian blue, marine blue, which has much more of a turquoise cast to it, and an ultramarine, which is often a typical sky color. So now we have permanent yellow light. I'm gonna have to skip that one for a minute. I forgot to reload my my palette. It is out in my palette. So we have Hansa yellow medium, and then I have a yellow ochre. Oh, and I can see already that yellow ochre is light. So sometimes you'll notice that colors, they take a bit more work when they're dry to release and become workable. And that yellow ochre is one of them. So I have a quadricrinodone burnt orange. I'm going to pull just a bit more color so you can see this has a fairly dark color range. Think of it as a kind of a root beer bottle, glass bottle orange. And then a burnt sienna, which is more of a warm brown. We have to grab that permanent yellow light, which has a bit of a yellow cast, a warm cast to it. Let me grab that really quickly. So take a look at what you see there. So if you're thinking about doing an exercise where you go from one complement to the other, like from yellow to blue, or orange, from orange to blue rather, you are going across the color wheel. And these colors are not orange, obviously, but they are close to it. You've got some that will probably have some greens result in here. They will be, they're much less likely to run towards a gray. If you wanted to aim for grays, you would go for your more your orange tones. So we're looking for some beautiful, fun greens in this case. And if you don't know what you're going to get, that makes it even more fun because you don't know what you're going to get. So here we go. Let's take off. Permanent yellow light. So I want to make sure that when I'm working across, I don't want to have to clean my palette a whole bunch. So I'm going to pick one at a time, do a small amount, and then swipe it. So I'm going to start with a little puddle of water. Relatively clean water this time, especially for me. There's a little puddle of permanent yellow light. And I'm going to take a tiny touch of concentrated phthalo blue red shade, mix it, and then just fill in. Now I'm going to put a little more weight to the bottom so that it dries with some variety. And then I'm going to swipe it. So that was quite a bit of paint. I swiped it, but I am going to try for a little less paint next time. A little less paint. This is again, excuse me, permanent yellow light. Now I'm going to add in peacock blue. The peacock blue is a nice clear, intense blue, and so you get a clear, intense color with this straight yellow. What will be interesting is when we get down here into the browns that read more orange, we will end up with a more broken green color. So you can see that we're working towards the more interesting moody colors as we get further toward the quadricranium burnt orange and the burnt sienna. So the next one, still have a little bit. That was fine. We have, oh, I started with blue. Let me always start with the same. Start with a touch of the permanent yellow light. Dry my brush. Grab a touch of Prussian blue. Pull that in. Swipe it. Do the same thing. Grab a touch of, maybe 2 touches of permanent yellow light. Wet and dry my brush. Grab some marine blue. My ratio might have been a little higher to blue that time than green, or than yellow, but I'm going to go ahead and go with it. So now the last one on this line is permanent yellow light and ultramarine. Ultramarine can sometimes have a grit to it. And you'll notice that I hand drew this grid and I did not draw the last line, so I'm going to draw it now. I do have room for a couple more if I wanted to add them later onto this page, and I also have room for color notes, or if I wanted to just keep going with the same set of warm colors, I could keep going with the rest of the blues and some of the grays I have. I'm leaving some options open for another time, and this is in one of my reference journals. So we've made it all the way across with all of the permanent yellow light that we were going to work on. So now we're switching, and it's all about Hansa Yellow Medium. I keep this extra piece of paper. I might want to make a touch here if I think that I didn't go quite 50-50, or just to dry off my brush sometimes. Touch of the Hansa. Hansa comes in medium and it comes in light also. So now it's the phthalo blue red shade. And then swipe. I'm getting better. Didn't use quite so much paint that time. It only takes us a little bit. And usually when you're painting, you have to work up a lot more. So sometimes it's hard to just do a little sample. Peacock blue. That's my next one. Peacock blue. Now you could break any of these green mixes that you're doing with a red, and that would be a further color mixing exercise I could do on the next page over. Take all of these, take whichever ones that are most appealing to me as greens, and then see what happens if I break them with a little bit of red. So that could be another exercise as a follow-up to really explore your palette of greens. So now we have Hansa Yellow Medium and Prussian Blue. So we take the Hansa, wash in the dirty water first and then the clean, and then dry my brush. A little Prussian Blue. Didn't quite take, you notice it's a little bit lighter. I didn't quite take very much Prussian Blue, so I think I'm going to add just a hair more. That was maybe a bit too much. So just going to add a little hair more because I don't feel like that color truly represented a 50-50 mix. So I just changed it a little bit. Next one, Hansa Yellow Medium, Marine Blue. Again, this is that kind of really clear, vibrant blue, kind of a blue-green. Then ultramarine. So take some of take some of the Hansa and take some of the ultramarine. That one might have gone a little far into the blue side, but you can see just a little bit makes a huge difference. And any of these pairings you could actually map up from the lightest barely green that you could make when just adding a touch of phthalo blue, from yellow all the way to phthalo blue. So you could span any of these out to explore the ratios that you need to get exactly the right tone that you want. And so, but by doing this, you can see which one might you want to focus on. Just another choice of an exercise that would be an expansion for color mixing. So now we finished the Hansa Yellow Medium line for this exercise. So let's go on to the yellow ochre. And as I recall, the yellow ochre, it's a little bit, can be a little bit of a weak color compared to some of these brights. So I'm just going to be very thoughtful and take just a touch of blue to balance it. Okay, didn't change that very much, and I think what I'm going to do is just take another touch and just see, push it just slightly lighter, slightly more green. You can see this one definitely makes more of a gray between the two. Let's see what it does with the next blue. So again, we have the yellow ochre, which is not very powerful, at least this brand of paint. I think this is a Daniel Smith. I probably need to upgrade to better quality paint. Daniel Smith is a good middle of the road paint, but in some certain colors, it's not my favorite. I've been changing over to whole bean lately. Yellow ochre and peacock blue is what we're doing. So now I'll take some peacock, put that in. It's interesting how this ochre really brings down the peacock. And I'm going to say I just don't feel like that first square was very representative of what I should be getting from those two colors. Too much water, too light. So I'm going to go ahead and just go over the first square. Could put an asterisk next to it if you needed to feel like, you know, hey, I had to go over this one. But you'll see it really does, it is just really making sort of an interesting, let's pull some of the ochre again. Yeah, it just makes this muddy, there we go, that's more of a mid-tone of it. Kind of an interesting broken color, muddy color. Now, so that might be a fun one to explore, just to see what does that do, because if you stretch that out from the yellow all the way to the phthalo blue as boxes, yellow with a little bit of phthalo blue, and you just kept going, that might be an interesting one. It might give you some great tones that would be excellent for neutrals, rocks, mountains in the far distance. Sometimes this ochre will split a little bit and be grainy, and so you might be able to get some good effects with that one. Yellow ochre and Prussian blue. So again, thinking about the strength of this yellow ochre. Definitely not reading as vibrant as the yellows in relationship to the blues, so I'm trying to use less blue to get a nice mid-tone. Otherwise it would just look blue, and that wouldn't be helpful information. So again, have kind of an interesting brownie color. I'm going to leave that one. That one looks good. That's a little bit on the ochre side, but I think that that gives me some good information. So already you can see that this line is yielding some great broken colors that are not greens from the yellow ochre. Kind of mild, muted tones. Let's look at marine blue. Let's see what marine blue will do. Makes it more of a green. That bright marine blue stands out, but it's a fairly muted green. And you might not want muted colors. You might want to live up here in some of these would make great eucalyptus colors. That bright, cheerful, sunshiny colors certainly are excellent colors for their purposes. It's just that these colors can sometimes be a bit easier to recognize or notice, and these are a little more difficult to stumble upon, and they can really make a difference when you're painting rocks and other forms that need more depth to them, and they will help make these colors stand out in your piece if you have a mix of muddier colors and more intense clear color. So the last one is yellow ochre and ultramarine. So let's get this one down. You can see that that ochre is finally starting to get wet, soaked in enough that it's releasing its color better. So I'm not having to scrub as much, but it's still fairly weak in comparison to the blue. So again, here's a kind of a green. I would say this is like a blue, green, brown, blue, gray. Fascinating color. And if you have a side sheet, if you found any of these you wanted to break out, for example, you could take this color you just did, break it out, make it lighter with each step of additional water that you add. And that's probably about as light as that will go. It could go darker, but for that you'd have to go back in and add more color. Trying to be a bit dry, I'm being a little watery here, but if you get enough ochre on your palette And where were we? This one was ultramarine. Get that ultramarine on the palette. I want to go a little more blue than that. That's what I'm looking for. Maybe one more step yet. If you find something that you know is close to something you might like, that's when you can go in and break it apart a little bit. You can make little dots. You can come in and grab different amounts. And just see it's kind of a nice gray. So you can have both things running at once if you want to. And you all have the code right here. You have the yellow ochre and the ultramarine. So you have that code when you need it to document what you have. And it's probably worth stopping in the middle of what you're doing and then just writing down ultra. For me, ultra always means ultramarine plus yellow ochre. So let's move on to the next. We're looking at the quadricrinidone burnt orange. This is a very clear color, much like marine blue, but in a brown. Nice and clear. So phthalo blue red shade was our first touch. So we're definitely getting more into the complementary mixing territory when we get down into the quadricrinidone burnt orange and burnt sienna. You could take this one again, pull over your spare piece and just put a little more water in. Also the idea that this paint's going to get swiped off anyway. So if you use it, it's not going to waste if you think you might want that color. So this one was quadricrinidone burnt orange. QB orange is my shorthand. And phthalo blue. Now this I just put in parentheses red because it's phthalo blue red shade. I'm specifically looking for some interesting colors like this for some backgrounds that I'm doing, so that when I have leafy colors in my foreground, I'm hoping to do a little series of spring flowers, that it will help it stand out. And right now we have this wintry world outside with muted colors, and then inside we have the regular bright colors of you know, maybe some growing houseplants and things. So I'm looking to expand my resource list, if you will, of some of these fun muted colors that are easily mixed. I mean, it's just 2 colors out of the tube to find that. Let's see. Quadricrinidone burnt orange, peacock. Let's see what these do. These are both very clear colors. Quadricrinidone and peacock. So I would expect a clear, it might be muddy, but it's also clear. It doesn't feel as gritty, light, very transparent. Okay, and then now we're going to do next one on the list, again with my quadricrinidone. A little bit watery, so let me add a little bit more. Noticed I started mixing bigger puddles again. Remind myself to use a little bit less if I can. Prussian blue. And if you put these two by themselves without mixing in a wet and wet situation, they would mix. So like if you took, here's another way to do that on the side. You could do a little light wash of, let's say, Prussian blue is our sky, right? Isn't that what we just picked? Yes. Prussian blue sky. Bring it down with some plain water. So you have an area of Prussian blue. And then drop in some quadriquinidone, and it will do some mixing on its own. And you would expect that you would end up with some areas that are this color, and that might make a great underpainting if you want to have brightness underneath and you are going to layer over with greens. So I should mark that down. I'm gonna write wet, wet, and the top, I'll just write it here because I can tell where I put the colors. Prussian plus quadriquinidone burnt orange. Then I can just let that happily mix off on the side. That's one of my favorite exercises to do, by the way, is doing that with spare paints or just playing as a warm-up, doing the wet into wet, dropping some atmospheric colors in, observing the mixes as I'm preparing to paint on a piece that I've composed. Let's move on here. Quadriquinidone burnt orange and marine blue. Okay, again, marine blue is a fairly clear color. It's that green, and I used way too much of it, I can tell. Completely swamped my quadriquinidone. There we go. So this one, because this marine blue is really more of a blue-green, it sits happily with the brown, and it's not as a broken feeling. It doesn't feel like a muddy version of a brown, of a green quite as much as some of the others who are more straight blues. And that's because the marine blue is closer on the color wheel to the orange, as it's almost a green. Let's see, the next one was quadriquinidone. And then let's go ahead and do ultramarine. This one is often used as sky color. So I find, you know, anything that you use elsewhere in your painting, it's nice to have another version of it somewhere. So I use ultramarine and sky. And then sometimes I'll use it for trees as well, because it has that similar tone. If you want a real cohesive look, you're getting mixes that use the same color. But if you don't want that kind of a look, then you need to go with something different, or make sure you combine a lot of a separate mix. Let's see, burnt sienna. Kind of a reddish brown. Let's do this phthalo blue and see what we get. Heading almost more to a purple, because it's enough of a reddish brown instead of, ooh, look at that, kind of a really beautiful Payne's gray purpley color. Let's bring that down a couple notches and see what happens. So this is the one we started out with. See if I can get a little darker there by increasing the pigment load. And then I'm going to do the stripe like I've been doing. Okay, so just kind of pull it out and see what we get. Plop some more versions of that in there just to kind of give myself a bit of a range without having to do all of the tiny little blops. This was burnt sienna and phthalo blue, and that was phthalo blue red shade. Gives us some more information. That's pretty gray. Would make in a high concentration, it would make a really nice foil for a black. Instead of having to use black, you could use this charcoal blue gray, kind of just like a Payne's gray, very similar. Let's look up burnt sienna and peacock blue. Burnt sienna and peacock blue. Now you could research this, and somebody else has obviously already done this, and color manufacturers are mixing colors to get other colors to sell you in the tube, which is fine. That's handy sometimes, but it is nice to do this as an exercise for yourself, because I feel like you can read about it, but at least for me, if I paint it, I am much more likely, let's spread that one out too, that one's fun. I am much more likely to remember, and then because I have my references, which I only recently started collecting, I did not do this for a long time, felt like it was too much. I know I'll just find the color every time, it's fine. But now I look back on some older paintings and I think I wonder what color I used that mix. It takes work to find it again. So I feel like this is actually waste less paint to find it this way. That was burnt sienna and peacock. Peacock blue. And if you were thinking about a specific painting or scene from a photograph or a specific composition in mind that had, and you were looking for certain colors, then maybe you would be pulling those out. And I'm just kind of generally pulling out some that I think are fun, that I think would work for pieces that I'm working on, but I don't have anything specific in mind. I'm not looking just for, a trio of greens that work really well together or have great contrast. I don't have a specific purpose for this little side piece that I'm working on other than just experimenting. Prussian blue, but that might be a good way to do it. Let's see, Prussian blue. Okay, another nice gray. Let's stretch it out just to see how it compares to the burnt sienna and phthalo. This one is the burnt sienna and Prussian. Really, this one is, when you look at compare the difference, this one is even more charcoal gray than burnt sienna and phthalo. This might actually be, if I looked it up, that might actually be Payne's gray. I'd have to look it up. Burnt sienna and Prussian. Some of these colors like Prussian, I just don't bother writing blue anymore. I know that color, but you might want to. Okay, wiping off the palette. We have two left. We have burnt sienna and marine blue. I feel like maybe I went a little too blue for how much burnt sienna I have. I'd like to explore the middle of it more. So I'm going to add more burnt sienna in and see what, yeah, let's explore that a little more. So that marine blue compared to the burnt sienna is pretty strong. But you can see kind of a lovely gray blue. And it's not unlike the, it's a little bit like the peacock. Peacock is, you know, definitely a different blue, but you can see how they're both very translucent, and one just has a slighter, one's slightly more green than the other. This one was burnt sienna and marine blue. So you can see, even if you did a dramatic sky using burnt sienna and you mixed in 2 or 3 of these, you could end up with this really dramatic, moody sky just by using burnt sienna and you know, 2 or 3, I guess you could do 4, several different blues. You could have kind of a puddle on your palette where you pulled a little bit more from peacock, a little more from phthalo. You had some clear areas that were maybe Prussian, and that would give you a great, interesting sky. Now, let's see what the very last one, the ultramarine, does, because that one is often used as a sky color. Let's see what that does in the mix. We've got, this is our last one. And this exercise, let's see. Burnt sienna, ultramarine. Find my ultramarine. I think I ever did it on the blue again. You can see how this burnt sienna, this type I have, whether it is the pigment itself or it is the brand, it's not as strong as a few of the blues I have. Oftentimes it's just the pigment itself. So this is a pretty middle of the road version. So one thing you could do if you are interested in experimenting with, like, how could I interpret this in with a sky color? So you can mix up a base of something like this, and you could do a wet and wet landscape area. Let's say we pull this all the way out. Small brushes, takes time. My water's a little dirty, let's see. So I'm just pulling it all in. You don't have to pull all the white out of it, but I am. So if I came in here and added some areas of this one, I could also just play, instead of cleaning my palette, I could also come in here and say, well, I also wanted to bring in a little bit of that marine blue. So I could grab some marine and just tweak it towards the marine. You can't wait for very long because it will definitely dry up on you. Maybe imagining like the surface of the water and some clouds just almost touching the surface. You come in with either a dry brush or let's just dry off our brush really good. You can come in and pull out some cloud forms. Really dry brush when it's pretty wet. Come in and pull out some clouds. And not in all the areas. You don't want to do hard sections in all the areas, but just a few highlights in places. I'm going to pull out a little bit of white right there. And a little bit of white here. And this is going to dry really light. But maybe I'm going to come in and do a little sienna and peacock on the very lowest level of it. And I'm just going to do it on top because I want it to calmly marry in with what I'm doing, not stand out. So it's okay that my palette is a bit dirty. So I'm just coming in with touches. And if you leave a dry area underneath that you want to come into, you can get a more solid version of that color. Okay, in danger of overworking this for sure. So stop yourself when you can. If you notice something like this forming, you can come in there and just pull the edge, scrub the edge a little bit. So you notice that this section they're drying at slightly different rates because I came in there with my brush. So you can make it a little bit worse by coming and scrubbing it again. But on this lower layer, I'm pulling out cloud forms. So I'm okay with it. Sometimes you might not be. But you can see how then on top of this layer, you could come in with denser versions of the darker colors. And just by picking out a few places and a few cloud forms to be more distinct, you would have a very calm, cohesive landscape image. All right, well, that's the exercise on colors that are kind of understanding how you can go from yellows, more clear yellows, which mix into greens when you go over to a blue, and then pulling it down into colors that are closer to a complementary mix so that you end up with muddier, more interesting, deep, broken colors. And you will sometimes want to use, sometimes you might want to live more in these fun, muddy colors. If you want a moody, atmospheric painting, if you want a more light, bright, kind of cheerful painting, you can live up in these colors. And you can also use extremes from both. You can pick from both sides to help pop out some of these brighter, clearer colors by giving backgrounds or giving shadows that live in this zone. So just an example of a small way that you can do that as a reference for yourself. You can see you can just continue on. It's like Pandora's box. You can keep going with this as much as you need over time, and probably what you'll discover is that some of these colors these are favorite colors of mine, but some of these might not work for you in terms of the mixes. You might not paint things you need them for. You don't need to have every color in your palette. This is 5 and 5 that give me a huge range to work within.